So this presentation topic is berries in high tunnels, what works and what doesn't. Kathy has been at Penn State since 1983, working with a variety of crops. She's been responsible for the statewide berry crop research and extension program since 1999, and has been working with high tunnel production since 2000. Currently, research projects include ones on containerized production of strawberries, strawberry anthracnose, and release of a parasitoid for spotted wing drosophila management. Thank you for joining us today, Kathy.
Okay, all righty. Well, I'll just go ahead here. So we'll get started. So we are going to go through quite a few slides here. There are a lot of photos, so hopefully this won't put anybody to sleep at this time of the day. But anyway, so I want to start off talking about what is a high tunnel and how does it differ from a greenhouse. So from the outside, a high tunnel is going to look an awful lot like a greenhouse. Usually it'll be covered with a plastic sheeting though, instead of, polycarbonate or glass. But the biggest difference is that you can plant your plants directly in the ground, as opposed to in a greenhouse where you'd normally have a gravel floor or perhaps some benches, that plants are on. And so why are we talking about berries is, kind of the question. There is interest in growing them in high tunnels, in part because they are high value and also high stakes. When I say they're expensive to grow, this is because when you're starting out producing them, the plants are going to be relatively expensive compared to, for example, getting a packet of seeds, like you might for your vegetables. And once you get them in the ground, there can be some time until they are established. And so that adds to, to some of the costs. They are also fragile, so they are easily bruised. They don't have a very long short shelf life normally, so they don't store very well. And they are susceptible to a number of different fruit rotting diseases that can affect all of this. But, customers do love them. There's nothing much better than a strawberry in the springtime. And so there's a strong market for them. So there's a lot of incentive to grow them. As I mentioned, they are fragile. One thing that can help with that is growing them in high tunnels because you have some environmental control. They aren't as likely to get, whipped around in the wind and bruised. You won't have rain falling on them so much to cause a lot of the, to increase a lot of the diseases. And also they do lengthen the growing season. So you'll have warmer temperatures in the springtime, warmer temperatures in the fall. And so on both ends of the growing season, you can add some time for the plants to grow. And so that results in the yields being higher. The other thing that growers often mention that I really hadn't thought about much when I started working with high tunnels was that it does improve the marketability. The berries look better. But on top of that, because you don't have those diseases, you can have some increases in shelf life as well. And so you can market better looking fruit for a longer time. The other thing that often happens is that you can end up with an increase in fruit size. So this is a day neutral strawberry called Cabrillo. Not really my favorite strawberry for flavor, but definitely they are huge and people will tend to go for larger berries. So this is a quart basket of some that we were growing in a containerized system in a high tunnel. So are there reasons not to use high tunnels? Yeah, there are a few. One is the added expense of putting, buying them and installing them, and installing the plastic on them. So they do cost more. And the payoff time for that tunnel does depend on which crop you're growing and what your management skills are like. David Connor, who was an economist at the University of Vermont, did a study looking at tomatoes being grown in high tunnels and the payoff time. And it ranged anywhere from less than a year to 72 years. So it really depends on, how you're doing with your crop in there. The other thing with high tunnels is they do take some management time, especially if you were manually venting them. You need to be on top of that. So, especially in the spring and fall, there will be a lot of days where you need to roll the sides up or down. But when you really look at it all, is it more per unit of fruit? I'm not really, sure on that one. Also, it seems like recently people have become more concerned about plastics and their use, and there isn't really good infrastructure for recycling high tunnels plastics right now. So we're going to talk a little bit about types of high tunnels. So there are both multi-bay and single bay tunnels. And we'll focus mainly on single bay tunnels for the majority of this talk, but I just want to kind of put tunnel use in perspective for you. So the multi-bay tunnels are typically only covered for 3 seasons. So that would normally be spring, summer, and fall in the northeastern US and the Midwest if they are used there. So sometimes these are called 3-season tunnels. And then the single bay tunnels are usually covered year round, but there are some brands of them that aren't very as beefy maybe as some of the ones that can take a snow load better. So those might be covered for just the growing season. But these types of tunnels can typically be called 4-season tunnels also when they are single bay ones that use fairly strong steel. So the type of plastic that's on them is usually a 6 to 8 mil plastic, and it has a 4-year life. So this is something I want to mention, that these plastics have additives in them that either prevent ultraviolet light from breaking down the plastic, the chemical bonds in the plastic, or some other manufacturers use additives that actually block the UV from coming through the plastic. But either of these results in an increased life to the plastic. If you went out and got a plastic sheet, perhaps a store where you might buy construction materials, those plastics usually would not be of the same kind, and they might, even though if they're heavyweight, they may still break down within less than a year if they don't have additives to either stabilize or block the UV effects. So the single bay tunnels, so these can come in various sizes. So you can see some different ones here. Over on the left, you see the tunnels we have out at our high tunnel facility. A lot of these do not have plastic on them right now, but this was while we were doing a study with raspberries and strawberries, and we were using a lot of the tunnels. Up on the upper right, this Pennsylvania grower that has raspberries in a tunnel. He has 20 by 150. And then on the lower right, this is a 30 by 72. So the wider a tunnel gets, the taller it will get. And so that is just something to keep in mind. 30 by 72 is a popular size because you get a lot of square footage for the size of the tunnel. But again, that one tends to be a little taller. So these single bay tunnels are mostly used in colder areas. They're good if you're just starting out too with learning about using tunnels. So we're going to talk a little bit about multi-bay tunnels. So these are ones that are usually used for large scale production. This graph on the right, I just want you to take a look at the red parts of the bars. This is strawberry production coming out of Mexico. So this graph on the right is where we get most of our strawberries from throughout the year in the US. And so the multi-bay tunnels are used for strawberries in Europe and Mexico, and also for raspberries in California. And if you've never seen them, they are fairly impressive. So we're just going to take a little quick tour of what those look like, just to put some things in perspective. So this is Guanajuato, Mexico, where there's a fair amount of strawberry production. And we're going to take a look at this little white dot over here. And we're just going to zoom in on what we're seeing there. So that little white dot's getting bigger. And it turns out that that little white dot we were looking at, and that was on Google, this is from Google Maps, is about a 16-acre field. And if you zoom in more, what you realize is that those are all actually tunnels down there. And then if you go to the interior of what that looks like, what you have is a 16-acre field. of strawberries being grown in the plasticulture system. And these are usually day neutral varieties that are then being shipped to other countries, including the US. So that's where some of our wintertime strawberries are coming from. If you see them coming out of Mexico, of course, there's a lot of winter production in Florida as well. So that's the other place. So that's kind of, one type of use of tunnels. And then if you look at the US raspberry production, California is the leading state for fresh market raspberries, not processing, and they have about 7,900 acres there in 2021. And according to folks from Driscoll's, they estimated about 90% of the California raspberries are grown under tunnels. They are also often used for organic production, again, just to help with some of the disease control. So some of the strawberries in California that are organic are grown in high tunnels as well. So we're going to take a look at Watsonville. If you've been paying attention to the news lately with all the rain that has been happening out there. Over here to the left is the Pacific Ocean. So this is Monterey Bay. Up here on the right are the Santa Cruz Mountains, and here where you see these kind of strange geographical features is actually where the San Andreas Fault is, and sandwiched in between the two, we have Watsonville here, which is the Driscoll's headquarters. And so we're going to zoom in and take a look at what's there. And what we are looking at are all these areas of white that you can see all through here. And so we'll zoom in a little, and then we'll zoom in some more. And what we are looking at, again, are a lot of tunnels that are being used. And so this is what the raspberry production will look like under these tunnels. So again, larger scale production. And so, part of the reason we're looking at that is, asking the question, why are they used so much in major production areas? And it is mainly because of providing a longer shelf life, which is one of the same reasons why some of our local growers like tunnels. And so in their case, that allows adding some time to the shelf life to allow for shipping and transport of the berries before they get to the consumers. If you're direct marketing, that means that once your customer takes the berries home, they aren't going to, mold the day after they've gotten home. So the other big thing, as I mentioned earlier, was an improved appearance, which is also important to our local growers. And then again, disease management, especially for organic growers. So, looking at some of the reasons on why the local growers are using high tunnels, though, instead of perhaps trying something more complicated like greenhouse production, is that there isn't any floor in that tunnel. And so they can plant directly in the ground. That means there's a lower learning curve for protected culture. So it's, so they can use a lot of the same types of systems that they're used to in a protected culture system. And then, another reason is these tunnels are something you can build yourself. So, and they are relatively affordable compared to buying a greenhouse. And then with all those different sizes, there's, a size that fits almost anybody's scale of production. And then with higher productivity per land area, this is definitely an issue in the East, where somebody who is a new grower who may not have land doesn't necessarily have access to enough land to be able to do field production. And so this can be a good entry point for them, or it can just be good for somebody who wants to, try berries on a smaller scale without getting into, acres of production. The other thing is that there is NRCS cost sharing available for putting these tunnels up. Do want to point out that with the NRCS cost sharing is, anybody who's bought a tunnel is hopefully aware there are some stipulations on what you can do with it and with those tunnels and how you can grow crops in them, and certain things related to the construction of them. For example, the end wall door size needs to be something that, that is safe, that people can get out of. So But what everybody has in common is just that you do need to make up the costs of the tunnel. And so most of our growers here that were growing raspberries, and then we're reporting a payback of the tunnel costs in about 2 to 3 years, just to give you an idea to, of what to reference. So, and I also do want to point out that, different people have different things they can sell better. And so what works best for one grower may be different than another. So, tomatoes are one where growers will make back costs typically fairly quickly. It doesn't take as much labor to produce those, to harvest those crops as it does berries. May take, as much though in terms of trellising and other things. But tomatoes are a really popular one here. So are salad greens. And so this is a grower in Pennsylvania where he was selling a salad mix. And so his way of making the mix, instead of producing larger areas of individual lettuces and greens and then combining them, was he just, alternated which lettuces he was planting in the high tunnel, and then he could harvest them and have an already mixed bag of mix, which was kind of interesting. Also, in terms of income per square foot, though, tomatoes and salad greens are fairly high, and so are herbs and cut flowers. If you look at the dollar of income per square foot of space. So I do just want to point that out. All of these will actually tend to be higher than berries. And so that's kind of the bad news for the purposes of this talk. However, it does depend on your market and what you're trying to accomplish. So sometimes growers just want the berries to pull customers into their markets. And then that helps with selling other products. So berries are something different, that not everybody has. And so, now we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about strawberries and high tunnels. Some of what we will talk about for strawberries is applicable to raspberries as well. So we'll spend more time on the strawberries and then kind of make the connections later. So there are a lot of different systems that can be used for strawberries, and really any of them can work. The question is, should you use them or not? So June bearers or day neutrals. So these are two different types of strawberries. June bearers, as you can tell from the name, are the ones that will produce a June crop and then they're done. So they may fit into certain people's production scheme. Day neutrals are the ones that you can plant in the springtime, or you can plant them in the fall, but for high tunnel, you may as well wait until spring. And then they will initiate flower buds continuously throughout the year. I do want to point out right now, you will see day neutrals appear under, they may be called different names. Technically, they are long day plants, so some scientists will call them that. They are also, though, something that will produce over a long season. So sometimes they're referred to as everbearers. And you can get lost in the semantics, but most often you will see them right now in nursery catalogs and other places called day neutrals. They used to be called everbearers in nursery catalogs a few years back. But when you look at what the growers are growing, generally there's been a better success rate in high tunnels with day neutrals. Questions are, do you have a market for the off-season berries? It seems like, even 5 or 8 years ago, people used to say that they couldn't sell off-season berries. Now consumers are used to seeing them in grocery stores almost year-round, so they don't seem to realize there's a strawberry season, a typical strawberry season in quotes anymore. And so it depends on where you are and how you are marketing them, and what you want to be able to sell and when. So whatever fits with your production operation. In a high tunnel, you can grow the June bearers so that they are planted in the fall as plug plants, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, and then harvest them in early spring. Or you can plant the day neutrals and then grow them throughout the season and mostly into the fall. So we'll talk a little bit about those systems some more. When it comes to what growers are finding success with, so we had done a survey of high tunnel growers, berry growers a while ago. Of 36 who answered our survey who were growing June bearing, also known as short day strawberries, 14 of those switched to other more profitable crops. So that was kind of an important thing to notice, was that, you know, they just weren't able to make a lot of money on these. However, of 35 that were growing day neutrals, only 6 of those had switched to other crops. So, you know, that was indicating they were happier with their day neutrals. And then when we asked the growers who hadn't switched, who were continuing to grow strawberries, what their future plans were in terms of increasing area, so that's the up arrow, versus decreasing area or keeping the same, proportionately the day neutral strawberry growers had bigger plans for increasing production in the future, which just tells you, you know, that's where they were finding better success. So they can be grown either in the ground, or they can be grown in containers. If you're reading a lot of the popular articles now, you're probably seeing a lot of, you know, a lot of references to growing in greenhouses or vertical systems, you know, or other more complicated production systems. So if you do want to grow in containers, that does add another layer to the costs. I also do want to point out that when it comes to NRCS, you will not, you know, you need to grow in the ground for at least 3 years, I believe is the current, you know, the current stipulation there. So this isn't even an option for, you know, a new high tunnel grower that had NRCS funding. So, so when people are sometimes growing in containers, is if they've been growing in tunnels for a while, if they are seeing some root rotting types of diseases present on their farms, perhaps they have, you know, a little bit heavier soils, or if nematodes are present. So we'll talk about each of these options a little more. So if you're growing in the ground in perhaps a plasticulture system like we see here in the upper right, that is probably, well, it is the most similar to growing strawberries in the field. So this is just going to be the, you know, the smallest leap to a new system. Basically, you've just moved to planting in a tunnel and having a cover over you. With a few adjustments that we'll talk about that the tunnels allow. If you are growing in a situation where perhaps the soil is limited, sometimes in urban settings, you may not have the greatest soil, there may be some compaction. Sometimes folks will try out permanent raised beds. This just adds still more cost though to the system, but you know, a few folks have tried this out. And then moving to growing in containers. If you're a grower perhaps who is already used to growing perhaps bedding plants or ornamentals or hanging baskets, or you're already familiar with greenhouse production in some way, that may not be a huge leap for you to grow in containers. And so, you know, so depending on where you're starting from, you know, might affect what you want to try doing with your berries. And then there are other more complicated things like, you know, gutter type systems or hanging trays or troughs. And, you know, here you kind of need to know what you're doing, and you do need to pay pretty close attention to what you're trying to do. So talk a little bit about the plasticulture system in high tunnels. So 2 different situations here. This was a Pennsylvania grower who was using multi-bay tunnels, and over on the left were some plants in a single bay. So this is very much like field plasticulture production. So normally what you do, again, with the June bears is plant in the fall for a spring harvest. If you do this, that does give you the option of being done with those berries fairly early in the spring and then moving into a different summer crop in your high tunnels. And then with day neutrals, again, you can plant in the fall or the spring for harvest throughout the year. So we're really not going to go into the production systems because they are into this production system in a high tunnel because it is so similar to plasticulture production in the field, and there is a fair amount of information available on that system in the field. So basically what you do is you move it into a high tunnel. So you'll be on a smaller scale. Your total yields will increase. In Pennsylvania, we got about 25% yield increase moving into tunnels compared to fields. So it wasn't tremendous. There was some information out of Iowa, though, where they saw a bigger increase in production in a high tunnel compared to a field plasticulture system. One of the big differences you'll notice is that anthracnose, that is a big problem with some of the varieties grown for strawberry plasticulture like Chandler, is that you'll see very little of it in a high tunnel. That is a rain splash disease, and it just can't splash around without the rain. So you see very little of it. Even if the plants do have the anthracnose organism lying dormant in them, you don't normally see the fruit rot of happening in the high tunnels. So one of the things we did find out was in the strawberry plasticulture system, we were having difficulty getting plug plants early enough for field production. We could plant them about a month later than our typical ideal planting time in the field, which would be mid-August here in Pennsylvania. We could plant the plants in mid-September, even into late September in a high tunnel, and still get equivalent yields to planting them a month earlier. So, so that was, helpful that way. I will mention the varieties that do best, things like Chandler or Camarosa, whatever you are normally using in a field plasticulture system will probably work in a high tunnel, except for the variety Sweet Charlie. That one's an early variety that comes out of dormancy early, and for us it bloomed in January. So, so other things you'll notice that the plants will grow larger. And so you might want to space them out just a little bit more than you do in the field. You are likely to have some issues with spider mites, which like high tunnels. And so we will talk about that more towards the end of the talk. And as I mentioned, you can follow then with a summer crop. So day neutrals in plasticulture. So basically, again, it's more like a plasticulture system. Those were all the pictures you were seeing. And it's very similar to day neutral strawberry production in the field on plastic. I do want to warn you that in a high tunnel, you may want to move to a white on black plastic instead of a black plastic, because that is likely to be just a little bit too hot in a tunnel, and they may take a break for production. So one thing with the in-ground production is one thing that doesn't work very well is following a crop like tomatoes with strawberries. With tomatoes, you will fertilize them with a lot higher fertilizer rates. And so you can get a salt buildup in the tunnels, especially if you're in a 4-season tunnel and the plastic is on year round. So, so basically, what you were seeing here is a salt buildup along the edges. And then we had a lot of tip burn on our strawberries when we followed tomatoes. Compaction can be an issue over time. This doesn't affect only strawberries, it'll affect any salt-sensitive crop. And so what you would want to do in that situation, if you have a 4-season tunnel and you're covering it year-round, is when you replace that plastic every 4 years, you want to make sure you leave that off, take it off in the fall, leave it off over the winter, let some winter rains and snow leach those salts out. This graph is just showing how much salt levels decrease between fall and spring when you take the tunnel off or the cover off. And basically where you have the higher salts level to start with is where you're seeing some of the bigger decreases here on a lot of these graph bars. So, so basically over here on the left, these were tunnels that have been uncovered for 1.5 years. You didn't have much salt to start with, so you didn't have as much to leach out. So, so that's something that'll help. If you're in a short-term situation where you need to do something, you can, about salts, you can potentially, if you have plastic mulch beds, apply enough water to leach the salts out into the row middles. That's the hard way to deal with this though. So, but it is possible to do. So this was the situation where we lost a lot of plants due to salt damage. We could leach the salts out. We could get the plants to grow fine by the next spring. We also, as you can see in the back, got the weeds to grow really well too. So containerized production. So we'll talk a little bit about this. This makes some economic sense with day neutrals if you can get high prices for your strawberries. So if you can get high enough prices, we have growers who are they're selling in pints. And so they're selling for like $4 to $5 per pint. If you can get up then to what's the equivalent of maybe $10 per quart, they're feeling really pretty good about this system at that point, but who wouldn't? So we've been working on a grower friendly system to try to move through or to work through how to do this. So basically what you need is media that has a good combination of drainage and the right pH. And so that pH is around, the 6.0 to 6.5 range. You want to have a water source that also has a pH between 6.0 and 6.5. If you have one that has high bicarbonates, you may need to do some acidification because that can be an issue. And then you want to match the right fertilizer with your water. So if you have one that tends to be higher in high pH and high bicarbonates, you may want an acidifying fertilizer for high bicarbonate waters. And then the other thing is you need to make sure your injector is working correctly, because if you don't, you're going to be sunk from the get-go. So you want to know what you're applying in terms of fertilizer. So our media type, you want one that has a good combination of good drainage and water holding capacity. So we'll talk about some of these, but what we ended up using was mixing our own 2-to-1 peat coarse perlite mix. We didn't want lime in our media because we did have a high bicarbonate water and we didn't really want to acidify the water if we could help it. And so that worked for that situation. This isn't something most growers want to mess with though. So if you're using a premix, you want to look for a media that has a high porosity. There are a lot that can work well. You don't want ones that are very fine and that hold water too much. So like we tried some Metro Mix media and mixes, and those did not work out that well for us. The roots just never grew the way they should have. If you're using something like Cora, that can have high salts, and so you need to flush that. With calcium nitrate actually helps with that quite a lot. So these are just some of our medias. This was our 2-to-1 peat perlite. This is a BK25, which is Pro Mix. Had a lot of perlite in it. That one worked well. So did Promix BX, which was a little chunkier. So that was pretty good. This was a heavier one, Frey Brothers F400. That one didn't work so well. The one that absolutely works best and but is very expensive, and I don't know if you can make the money back on this, but it's from BVB Substrates in the Netherlands. It's a very chunky mix, and it's also more acidic than the others. And the strawberries absolutely loved that one. So that was our best. And then these are two other ones that are high porosity mixes, BM5 and BM6, which is from Berger out of Quebec, where they are doing some containerized berry production. And these are two that they are using that work fairly well as well. So other things that are important, having a deep enough container really helps. At least 6 inches deep does help. It gives you more margin for error when you water. It's harder to overwater them, but also the roots can reach down deeper. So on a drier day, they have more capacity and have some moisture they can access if you don't notice that they dried out. Once the plants get really big compared to the container size, they can use a lot of water fast, especially on a windy day. So we switched from using what you might call slabs or grow sleeves to white gallon pots that are white on black grow bags. And one thing I will say about the grow bags is they are harder to fill than pots because they're so floppy. So some of our growers have moved from grow bags to using pots. So we used emitters where each pot had its own emitter. These were 2 gallon per hour emitters with a 4-way splitter on them. So we had a 0.5 gallon per hour emitter stick per pot. And that worked out fairly well. Most times we would water them once a day for only about 15 to 20 minutes. But sometimes on really dry days, we did need to water them twice. And then fertility, so 100 parts per million nitrogen as a constant feed was what we ended up using for strawberries and raspberries. These were some new plants we had just put in. We did end up using 2 different brands that we tried out. Both worked. Both were for high bicarbonate waters. In our case, we ended up going with a 2720 fertilizer for high bicarbonate waters, and that worked out really well for us. And you'll see some pictures of other plants later. There are some berry formulas out there. I did not try those. You can also mix your own fertilizer. That gets pretty complicated though, and you do need to know what you're doing there. So one thing I will point out, if you're going to try containers, you do want to allow enough time in the spring to get all your items together and plant them early. So you can plant them, as soon as it's warm enough to be in a tunnel. Often we were in the 70s, in February, even in our tunnel. So we could start getting things together and start, growing, so that we had our plants in, towards the end of March, very early April at the latest. And so that just allows more time for the plants to grow and to have more fruit production. And then having a market where you can get a good price, to farmers market, or for example, is where folks seem to do pretty well with this. So gutter systems, we're not really going to talk about these at all. They are doable, but they are really fussy. And so, I don't really recommend starting out this way unless you have some really good advice on how to proceed. So regardless which system you are growing, I do want to point out that we do tend to see some problems with powdery mildew and in tunnels where the humidity is higher. So there isn't a whole lot of wind in there, and so you do want to be on a site where you at least have some wind flow through the tunnel and keep it vented. This is an even bigger problem in greenhouses, though, especially with a variety seascape. And then keep an eye out for spider mites. And again, we'll talk about that more in a little bit. So we're not going to spend a tremendous amount of time on red raspberries just because they are so darn easy. Well, red raspberries are brambles in a tunnel, but we will spend some time. So we'll talk about this. So we'll probably focus mainly on red raspberries because these seem to be the ones that are quite profitable for a lot of people. So I had shown you some picture where you saw raspberries when they were younger. This was getting into I believe we were in our 3rd year here, but just, some really pretty tremendous growth. So we'll focus on these. Some of our growers, though, have done well with black raspberries, mainly in our Amish and Mennonite populations, have been pretty fond of them and used to growing them in the field. So here we have the variety Niwot, which is a primocane fruiter. In a tunnel. Up here, we are looking at the variety Polka, actually in the foreground, and back here, we had Josephine. So, and then you can grow blackberries in a tunnel as well. The issue with blackberries is, well, both they and raspberries are susceptible to spotted wing Drosophila. The blackberries need to stay on the plant a little longer to ripen, and so the spotted wing Drosophila becomes more of an issue. We also had troubles just with managing too much growth on the blackberries in the tunnels, where we needed to almost train them so that they were not totally vertical. If we trellised them upright, they just hit the tunnel roof, and then would end up tipping them 2 or 3 times to keep them from growing too much, which was sort of a strange problem to have. In the field here, we normally would have a lot of winter kill, and typically can't even grow blackberries in central Pennsylvania all that well without having a lot of winter injury. That totally disappeared once we put them in a tunnel, but then we had the opposite problem of having trouble managing the growth. So looking at the brambles, though, so this was 73 grower responses growing different types of brambles. And the folks who were growing the black raspberries were happy with them. I just am not sure that they were really keeping track of the economics because the yields were lower on them. And I don't know if they were really making payback or not. It's possible, though, that if you do grow them and you're doing value added products, that you might, maybe be able to make some additional money just off of a relatively small volume of fruit. So again, comparing floricane fruiters. So these are going to be your summer bears that produce in July on both raspberries and blackberries, compared to ones that are the primocane fruiters. So those are the ones that are going to be fruiting all summer long. You can fruit them for just the fall, which some growers do as well. And so when you look, the primocane fruiting varieties were really the ones where proportionately very few people were discontinuing production, and a very high proportion of them were planning to increase acreage. Now, I do want to mention that this was before spotted wing drosophila came along, and that really was a game changer for a lot of our producers on what they decided to do. So, so there is the potential for the productivity and for some profitability in this, but you do need to be on top of spotted wing drosophila. Early on, pesticide labeling was such that any insecticide that could be used in a field could be used in a high tunnel. That has recently changed and complicated things a lot. Because now, at least in Pennsylvania, the interpretation is that the product needs to be labeled for greenhouse production before it can be used in a high tunnel. And so that's made things more complicated. And so some of our producers have gotten out of production, other ones haven't. So we'll go through how you can grow the plants. So growing them in the ground or containers works. Field production is very similar to high tunnel production of raspberries and blackberries. So basically, any variety, if it grows well in the field, is going to grow well in a high tunnel. I feel fairly confident saying that. In-ground production is easier than containerized production. The biggest mistake our growers have made, and the most common one, is putting the rows too close together. So typically what's happened is, and I made the very same mistake myself, is I would plant the plants and put them in the ground. I would look at them. They would grow that first year, and I would think, gee, the next year I would put in an additional planting, so maybe another tunnel. Or in this case, a grower put in a new planting. The next year, he decided to expand his production. So he put in a row in between each of the first one, where he'd put in his first rows. And then he ended up coming back and taking that row out. In my case, I had put them 2 rows in a tunnel, so they were 8 feet apart. The next tunnel I did, I said, oh, maybe I can squeeze more in. So I put them on 4-foot row spacing. And that was a big mistake because it was really hard to manage the growth and to walk through between the rows. So I don't recommend doing either of these things. So just make sure that your rows are at least 7 to 8 feet apart, unless you are able to spend a lot of time doing trellising and keeping your rows narrow. I do know some growers who've gone down to a 6-foot row spacing, but they do spend more time trellising the plants. Some varieties. So if it works in a field, it'll probably work in a tunnel. The other thing I want to mention, though, is that if you're going with a primocane fruiter, primocane fruiter or floricane fruiter, the second year your harvest is going to start 2 to 3 weeks earlier than it did the first year. Now, if it's a floricane fruiter, you weren't going to get a harvest that first year anyway, but your primocane fruiters would normally be able to produce a crop the first year. And then the next year, you will find that because they are already growing in the springtime, you will get the fruit off of them even earlier. So what this means is that if you have a variety, that is just too late for the field. I had mentioned Josephine that we were growing in our high tunnels. We could not get a crop off of that one in the field before we got a frost. In a high tunnel, that wasn't really a problem anymore because it was producing early enough that we could get good crop off of it in the fall if we just wanted to produce off the primary grains, or if we wanted to produce it all summer long, we could get both the summer crop and fall crop off of it and get good yields. So if you have something you really like, Nantahala, for example, is one from NC State that has a wonderful flavor. It's not, it hasn't really taken off in field production, so I don't know if it's still available, but it had tremendous flavor. We couldn't grow it in a field, but we could grow it in a tunnel. So fertilization, you want a pH between 6 and 6.5, maybe err a little bit on the low side. If you're in a tunnel, just because we've seen that sometimes the pH tends to creep up a little bit over time. If we're using things like composts for some of our nutrients. I do also want to point out, though, that your reading may be higher than it actually looks if you have high salts, which is kind of an interesting thing. We didn't realize till we had salt problems. So nitrogen, same fertilizer rates as you'd use in field production. Is probably sufficient just because you have less leaching of the nutrients. You do have more growth and crop removal, but these two seem to balance out. You do want your potassium to be in balance with your nitrogen. So for example, I mentioned a 27-20 fertilizer that works well because it has that additional potassium in there. You're removing a lot of potassium in the fruit, and that's the reason for that. And then we do want you to do tissue tests each year. So containerized raspberries, you don't really need to put them in containers, but they are relatively easy to do compared to strawberries if you want to try. The problem is you need to figure out a way to overwinter the containers so the roots don't freeze. We did see high yields off of these. 4 to 6 pounds per plant, similar to, and we grew them similarly to the way we did containerized strawberries, but we used bigger pots, and it really didn't matter what media we tried, it just worked. So we're going to go through some of the general issues. I do want to point out that you should test your irrigation water. So rainfall is excluded, so you really depend on that irrigation source for all of your water. And so you want to test it, look for high bicarbonates, high pH. Some water sources can have some salts in them, at least in Pennsylvania. And so you want to watch for that. And so test that water source. As far as how you water, you can use trickle tape if you're growing in the ground or emitters and containers. Either one works. Ventilation is important. So the wind speed is decreased somewhat by the structure. But you do want some airflow within and through the tunnel. And so just, keep those tunnels vented and err on the side of maybe venting them a little too much rather than not enough. That's important for foliage drying and disease control. And I also want to point out that regulations and rules may vary. So just be aware of those, both local, state, and national ones, and any stipulations that go on along with NRCS funding. There's some questions regarding how tunnels are taxed in different municipalities here in Pennsylvania. Our state legislature did pass some legislation that helped with that does define them as temporary structures. So that helped with that. In New Jersey, I know they're getting into problems with some construction codes. We haven't seen that in Pennsylvania yet, but I guess it can happen. And here we do have some problems related to stormwater management plans and whether tunnels fall under those or not. And then I already talked a little bit about pesticide use and worker protection standards and what the label needs to look like in order for a product to be used in a high tunnel. So locally, that's going to be something to sort out. So I just want to talk a little bit about two-spotted spider mites. So these can be a big problem, especially if you're using broad spectrum insecticides, which are often harder on beneficials than they are on two-spotted spider mites. Some of these insecticides do actually increase how many eggs a two-spotted spider mite lays. So just be aware of that. What we have ended up doing that has worked actually fairly well for us is we do release predatory mites in our tunnels. They seem to they seem to establish really well in the tunnels. And so, show you a little bit more about that on the next slide. But the thing with spider mites is that, there isn't any moisture on leaves, which is tough on the spider mites. So it's hot and dry, and it's what a spider mite really loves. So we release the predators. You can see one in this picture here. When the two-spotted spider mite populations are low, you'll look for them on the lower leaves. We've had best results when we've used a mixture of predators that are good for different situations. So some of them, like higher or lower humidity or higher or lower temperatures, we had good luck with a mix of two different species. And then if if the spider mites get away from you and you need to knock them back, you can just give the plants a spray of water or insecticidal soap to knock populations back first and then release predators. And that'll help out in that situation. So spotted winged Drosophila, this has been a big problem for bramble growers. We've actually had relatively low populations in tunnels compared to the field, and the problem is that any of them are too many. So, so it's warmer in there. What helps is that once you're in a tunnel, you're never missing a harvest because of rain. So you can keep the fruit cleaned off really well. That helps a lot. You can reduce your harvest interval. So some of our growers have reduced their harvest interval from 2 to 3 days to 1 to 2 days. That has helped a lot with knocking spotted winged Drosophila back. Some of them are pretty careful with their canes to make sure that if they do need a spray, they can get good coverage. And then also we ended up using landscape fabric, and so have some growers in the tunnels, which reduces the humidity, which spotted winged Drosophila loves higher humidity. And so again, that helps too. And then if you can harvest that fruit, get it refrigerated as close to 32 degrees as possible right afterwards, that helps a lot. Some growers are using exclusion netting. You need fans if you're going to do that. Oddly, we've seen some differences between different plastic types, but we're still working that out. So. And then one other problem is with high heat during flower bud development, you may see some split receptacles. Usually not a whole lot of that though. And then sun scald, this is typically only a problem a few days each year. The diffusing types of plastics, which we didn't really talk about, some diffuse light more than others, that can help there. But this is what sun scald looks like. And then pollinators have not been a problem in terms of getting them in, except that the honeybees seem to get a little confused. And so they tend to get stuck in the peak of the tunnel. Bumblebees just really haven't had a problem in the tunnels. It's been humming away in there. They seem to be able to find their way out somehow. If you open the door, they'll go out the door for you. They're really, really interesting little creatures. If anything, sometimes we've been concerned that they might be overworking the blossoms and we might have too many. I do want to point out too that if you ever see either in the field or in high tunnels, if you see canes where you just see a hole in the very tip, very end of a tip cane, this may just be a solitary bee that is a pollinator. If you see something like that, cut the cane just maybe 6 inches down from the tip. And if that hole does not continue lower to continue down through the cane, it's probably a pollinator. So just keep that tip, put it somewhere, and you'll have some solitary bees hatching out of it later. That is very common here. And then of course, wind and weather. I know you tend to have a lot more wind in the Midwest, but we are on a windy site here as well. So you do want to make sure when you're building a tunnel that you have have some good strapping on it, ropes across it like you saw on the tunnels in Mexico and California will help quite a bit. And yeah, and so I will actually show you some sources of information to help. So basically, the berries do have potential, but still recommend starting small. Consider other crops, to find out what's going to work best for you. And then, make sure you're using, a system that you can manage that isn't, just too much for you. So you can, do a good job with it and produce high enough yields to justify the costs. So I am going to show you some pictures of some sources for more information. At Cornell, we do have a high tunnel production guide for raspberries and blackberries. That's a multi-state publication from a multi-state grant that we had. There's also one on low tunnels. And we can put these addresses in the chat. If you ever want to use low tunnels, we didn't touch on those. I like the high tunnels better myself. And then more information on day neutral strawberry production in general, if you want to learn more about that. And then we do have a series of videos here, if you're interested in those. High tunnel structures, the basics. And that's 5 different videos on building a high tunnel. One that, hasn't got a lot of views, but I think is really useful is this one on squaring a high tunnel. If you know construction already, you're fine with that. If you're newer to it, that one has some really easy ways for how to get a tunnel squared up. And then I need to thank our funding agencies here. So it looks like we have a few minutes for questions. So how do we want to go from here?
Has questions, and I'll relay them. Any questions? Thank you, Bob.
You talked about return or payback, return on investment in 2 to 3 years on everberry and strawberry production in a high tunnel. Does that include or does that compare like field growing compared to just growing a high tunnel over it?
Did you hear the question?
I did not.
Okay. It was, okay, I'm going to try to interpret this. So the idea that if you've got covered like strawberries, everbearing strawberries in a high tunnel, that it's a 2-year payback. How does that compare to a field? Is that correct?
Yeah, but so it's actually kind of a tougher question, you would think, because it depends on the price you think you can get. So what can you normally sell? So all right, so there's 2 things going into it. One is the price. The labor is the other big part of it, and what you're paying your labor. So the high tunnels pay for places like California because they have a relatively low labor cost and a relatively high yield. For our producers here, when we're growing the everbearers in a containerized system, they're continuing to do that year after year because they feel like each year is paying. In the plasticulture system in a high tunnel, I would want to see you getting a fairly high price off of them. And by that, I'm meaning probably $5 to $6 a quart. I think you could make your costs back. But I don't have numbers on the actual payback of the tunnel structure itself. So I would put that probably in the 3, just shooting from the hip in this, probably in a 3 to 4 year range though. Does that kind of answer it, or did I miss it?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, all righty.
More thoughts to think about. Anyone else? Okay. That was it for questions of the group.
Pardon?
So that was the only question from the group. So thank you very
Okay,
much.
alrighty. I know we covered a lot here and it is getting late. So anyway, but I appreciate the attendance.
Thank you so much for being on today. This is great.
Okay, alrighty, you bet. Do you have a way to get these into the chat, or do you want me to just stop sharing? And
Yep. I think the best way is if you just, do we have your PowerPoint?
You do, yes.
So then it's probably just easiest for us to share it out, and then the recording will also have the PowerPoint.
Okay, alrighty, great. Okay, well, I will stop sharing my screen, and thank you so much for the invitation. Take care.
Can't Can't figure out how to hit, oh, there we go, my mouse is working now.